Hello everybody, my name is Daulton Nelson, and today I'd like to give my thoughts on a game I just beat. That game being Force Gemini for the Nintendo 64. Force Gemini is a third-person shooter developed and published by Rare Limited. Rare is a video game development company that had quite the heyday back in the Nintendo 64 era. It released classic after classic with games like Banjo and Kazooie, Perfect Dark, and GoldenEye 007. Since then, however, Rare has failed to live up to that time period, with lukewarm sequels and forgotten one-offs, but it's not like Rare exactly had a perfect track record in their most classic period either. Blast Corps isn't remembered too fondly, nobody even acknowledges they made Mickey's Speedway USA, and they even made one of the most infamous 3D platformers in Donkey Kong 64. Force Gemini, from what I could gather, sits in a space between Rare's best and worst in terms of fan reception. Some people really like this game, and champion it as a hidden gem. Others lambast the game as a failed experiment for Rare. For this review, I regretfully say that I sit in the latter category after playing through Gemini. In my opinion, Force Gemini was an agonizing experience to sit through. The game comes off as aged, clumsy, and even incompetent at times. Let's start with the positives first. Force Gemini is a third-person shooter where you play as the titular space team as they wander the galaxy, helping others. At the start of the game, the Force gets a distress call from a koala-looking race called the Tribals, who are being terrorized by an ant-looking race called the Drones. The Force's ship is then attacked by a drone army, and all three of Gemini's members get separated. One of its members, Juno, ends up on the forest planet of Goldwood, where he helps the Tribals get rid of the drones. It's here where he learns from the tribal king, named Jeff, that the drones are led by an evil overlord named Mizar. Thus, an intergalactic adventure ensues, where the Force Gemini must reconvene and go after Mizar and his hordes of evil drones. It's a great way to start out the game. It gives this Saturday morning cartoon type vibe, which Rare feeds into for both the style and the sound of the game. Everything in Force Gemini is super vibrant and colorful. All of the characters look very stylish, almost toy-like. Meanwhile, the score backing everything up is gorgeously full of horns. It's very inspiring and detailed. You may not even be able to tell what you're hearing is being synthesized. The way the main characters are handled in Gemini lends itself to a neat three-character system. You have three distinctly different characters to choose from. There's Juno, a boy who can walk in lava, Vela, a blue-haired girl who can swim in water, and Lupus, a dog who has a cannon on his back and can hover in the air with the jet thrusters he has attached to him. Naturally, Lupus is my favorite. It's a good way to keep things interesting, in theory, which is where my praise for the game stops. The way Force Gemini is set up is through individual levels where you are forced to play as one of the main characters. Each level is like a series of rooms or hallways connected by doors. Your basic goal for these is to get to the end. It's a tried and true method for game flow and progression, so there's nothing out of the ordinary yet. That is until that three-character system starts to factor into it. The way Force Gemini handles levels for each character is by giving them their own, storyline or campaign. For the most part, what each of the Force does is disconnected from each other, and does not affect anything outside of their own storyline. And because of this, following each character can be a chore, as it can be hard to remember what happened, or where you were the last time you played as this specific character. To make matters worse, there's a part of the story where all three members have to meet up to continue progress. But the game doesn't tell you this, at all. It's like all of a sudden you get to this meetup point, and you just have to know that you have to play through the other two characters' stories first, before you can do anything else. And there isn't any indication as to what levels a character has beaten, or how many they've beaten. There's a map in the game, but that barely tells me anything. And to make matters even worse, yes, it gets worse, whenever you unlock the ability to follow another character's story, that new character will start out as if you had just started playing the game. Any progress you make with one of the characters does not carry over to the others. This can be super frustrating to have to collect the same weapons, key cards, and key items all over again for each member of the team. And speaking of the weapons and the shooting in general for Force Gemini, it's not good. Let's start with the shooting. The standard shooting in Force Gemini is in the third person, directly behind the back. if your character gets too close to the camera, they become translucent so that you can see. The shooting is done by pulling the Z trigger, in which case the character will try to automatically shoot at whatever is in front of it, which works well for the most part, but only if you're pointing in the direction of your enemies, and you aren't trying to shoot at anything that isn't on the same plane as you. Frustratingly, the way the character moves is very tank-like. Pressing forward makes your character go forward, and pressing back makes your character walk backwards, although at a much slower rate. Tilting your movement stick to the side will cause the character to rotate in that direction, again, like a tank. There are dedicated strafing buttons, but, in my opinion, they fail to alleviate the very awkward feeling movement. In addition to the third-person shooting, you can also press a button to enter a first-person shooting mode. This locks your character in place until you exit it, but in return, you can use this new perspective to land more accurate shots, and get at the enemies that are up high. At least in theory, but in practice I found the looking to be way too sensitive in the vertical directions to aim properly, as well as this just leaves you open to enemy fire, and the looking implements spring look, which, to those of you who don't know, spring look was a thing where the camera would constantly reset to a specific point as you were aiming. Back in the day, console controllers weren't designed well enough to make shooting in 3D feel intuitive, so spring look was implemented to help console players from getting lost and from having to move the stick around all the time. But this is a mechanic that has not aged well in the slightest. It's hard to get any aiming done when you're constantly fighting for control just to look at the thing you're shooting at. What also doesn't help the shooting in the game is the constant dips in frame rate that will happen when a lot of the action is happening on screen. This can and will affect things like shot accuracy and response time. Also, the way the Nintendo 64 draws things makes characters in the far depths of Jet Force Gemini look pixelated, blurry, hard to see in general. It is surprising not to see much fog in the game, but at what cost this has to performance I don't know. I can't imagine fog being any better. And this very clunky and aged shooting is supported by a very poor roster of weaponry. There is a weapon I like, the Tri-Rocket Launcher, but everything else I just can't stand. Like the basic pistol in the game, which has a decent fire rate as long as the charge on it isn't depleted, but when you shoot, this bar that's next to your pistol on the UI depletes. When it's fully gone, the pistol's fire rate lengthens considerably. And because of the lack of ammo the developers give you for the rest of your weaponry, this pistol is what you'll be using for the majority of the game. Then there's the Submachine Gun, whose fire spread is so ridiculous that only 3 shots out of 100 would land if you were shooting at a door that was 3 feet in front of you. You waste so much ammo firing this thing, it's a wonder why this gun wasn't the default weapon players started out with instead. There's also a shotgun where you can charge up the shots for extra damage, but the enemies move around so much in the game that I don't know when you would use this. There are also grenades your character can throw, but the throwing arc is not communicated, and the blast from these can damage your own character, taking away a good chunk of health. And finally the sniper rifle, whose zooming function is okay, but how you do that isn't explained, and this weapon is so underutilized that its inclusion feels like an afterthought. And I hope at this point you can start to see why this game made me so unhappy. 90% of this game is shooting, so if that feels awkward and frustrating, then 90% of the game feels awkward and frustrating. But that's not it though. Believe it or not, there's more. I'd like to go back to the levels themselves for a bit and talk a little more about them. You see, for each level in the game, you are given 3 lives to beat it. Every time you die, you end up back at the start of the room you died in, and if you lose all of your lives, you have to start the whole level over again. How fun. Not. Why lives even made it into the final product is beyond me. This just creates further stress, as I don't want to play through these levels again. The shooting and movement feels like garbage, so why would I want to do more of the same? Furthermore, the game is relentless in its enemy placement. Right out of the gate, the developers expect you to take on hordes of bugs at different heights. You barely get to grips with the shooting before you're just lit up and made into Swiss cheese by the enemy. And keep in mind that one of my favorite games of this year, Bangai Spirits, did the same thing, and I criticized it for doing that as well. But where Spirits had tight controls, fun weapons, and bite-sized levels, Jet Force Gemini is quite the opposite. This causes you to lose massive amounts of health at a given time while you're futzing your way to some sort of cover. Speaking of which, Jet Force Gemini uses a very Metroidvanian health system where your health is made up of 5 health bars that can be extended, but in a game like Metroid, getting an energy tank gives you a whole additional health bar. Meanwhile in Jet Force Gemini, the game implements this very odd extension to your health, where the health that's in each bar gets extended itself. And it certainly doesn't help the game become any easier to tank through. You'll still be dying at the same rate. This could be remedied if the developers put plenty of health and ammo in the levels, but they do not. As I said, you barely get any ammo in the game, causing you to use the terrible pistol for most of it. And while enemies do drop health once in a while, the health bounces on the ground as if the level has 0 gravity, which it does not. You just watch the thing slowly disappear as you wait for it to fall to the ground. And, as you can guess, this makes the bosses in the game all the more dreadful. At least, the developers had the sense to put health and ammo in a room before you fight the boss, but trust me when I say that the bosses still aren't very fun to get through. I especially hated the Twin Mantis boss fight, where you have to hit very small hitboxes in very small windows of time. I also hated the fight with Mizar, who, despite being the big bad of the game, has the easiest boss fight in the game. Insultingly easy. But the real kicker comes after this fight, where Mizar escapes to some meteor, and the only way to fight him in order to beat the game is that you have to save all of the tribals in the game. Yes, I've been saving this for last. You see, while playing through the levels of the game, you'll run into the tribals that you can save. There's a certain number that are in each level. Some are very hidden, and some are out in the open. Some are put behind pits of lava, or banks of water, or on the other sides of giant cliffs, which means you'll need certain characters to get to certain tribals. But when going through the game the first time with each character having their own campaign, there will be levels where you'll run into an obstacle you can't get past. So when you beat Mizar the first time, you are then able to go back to the levels you already played through as any of the 3 main cast. But any tribals you already saved in a level do not count unless you save them all. Plus, you can accidentally kill the tribals, or you have to get them in time before they're killed. And if any one tribal is killed or missed, that means you have to start the whole level over again, and try to get them all again. And once I started trying to do this frustrating backtracking and collecting for the first world of the game, I called it quits. There is no way I'm putting myself through that just to see the end credits. No, thank you. If someone else can put themselves through that and think it's fun, good on them. But for me, the clunky controls, unforgiving challenge, and terrible shooting mechanics makes this one of the worst experiences I've played this year. So I'm going to give Jet Force Gemini a final score of a high 2 out of 10. The only thing that saves this game for me is the score, the style, and the sense of adventure. Maybe Jet Force Gemini plays better on the Rare Replay release, but as far as the original Nintendo 64 experience goes, I say steer clear. That concludes my review of Jet Force Gemini. If you like my reviews, you can like, comment, or subscribe. I also have social media links down in the description below, as well as a link to my online portfolio, where you can see video game design works that I have done, as well as a link to my Backloggd profile, where you can see my scores. And with that out of the way, please make sure to have a nice day.